Okay, so when we think of neurons, we usually think of the brain because neurons are also called brain cells. But there are billions of neurons of different kinds, 86 billion of them existing in the brain and 170 million of them in our gut. The enteric brain is also called a second brain, and it is an extension of our nervous system. And after you watch this video, you'll have a basic but solid understanding of its anatomy, the key mechanisms at play, and what it takes to keep it running in balance. The reason I want to talk about this topic and the reason I am so passionate about nutrition in general is because our microbiome's composition plays a major role in hunger, satiety, which means how hungry and how full we are at any given time, and also how we metabolize food for energy. Our ability to digest food adequately and many other aspects of our mood and general sense of well-being are also impacted by the health of our gut. But before we begin, I want to be clear about my scope of knowledge and what I'm trying to do here in my channel. First of all, I am not a doctor or a professional researcher. I am someone who was on the path to become a registered dietitian, but instead I decided to follow my instinct and started a career in health education and technology. I started this channel specifically because I want to help everyone that cares to watch how to take care of your body and how your body works in very simple terms. I want to take on big topics and break them up in a way that they sink in, and once you understand the basics of your own biology, you'll basically be unstoppable. I really believe that once you grasp the basic mechanisms of what your body is able to do and how it is able to stay in balance, you won't be easily persuaded or dissuaded because you will be able to explain these things in your own words. One of my favorite quotes says that belief can be manipulated, only knowledge is dangerous. And I truly believe that. This quote is by Frank Herbert, who is the author of the Dune trilogy. It's actually 6 books, but that's not the point. I have a deep sense of admiration for the human body. I love talking about its complexity and resilience, and I also happen to love food and talking about how food basically becomes us. And I think there's just something really beautiful in that. I also have found that visuals are key in helping get complex ideas across. So I'll be using fun and quirky animations to help us on this journey. With that said, let's get started. So not too long ago, it was believed that we were born with a preset number of neurons based on a finite number of neural stem cells. Basically, whatever you were born with, that's what you had. And think of stem cells as mother cells. So if you were born with X billion stem cells, you could only ever have X billion brain cells. So of course, these go through reproduction cycles, but still the idea was that this number remained the same throughout your life. But scientists have developed new theories that prove that new neurons can continue to form in adulthood. This is called neuroplasticity. It basically highlights the brain's resilience and adaptable nature. And this is good for us to know because it signals that our brain is able to adjust to new challenges even later in life. One of the most interesting things that I came across while writing was a Swiss literature review that was published in 2021 on the topic of gut microbiota and neuroplasticity. And it says that there is accumulating evidence linking, quote, bacteria in the gut and neurons in the brain, which has led to a paradigm shift in the neurosciences, end quote. So this is important. This is big because now there is mounting evidence that there is a direct relationship between the food we eat, the gut microbiome, and mental wellness. By the way, all the studies I am talking about are linked below. But before we get into the fun stuff, I want us to break down the gut-brain axis basic anatomy so that you can really understand kind of like the wiring, right? Like what's under the hood, so that you can begin to put these concepts in a more tangible way later. Okay, so how are the brain and the gut physically connected? And why do we have millions of neurons throughout our GI tract? It all comes down to one word: efficiency. I think it helps to think of the GI tract as a kind of ship with multiple levels, which are all connected by multiple sets of passages, staircases, and even the external structures to support the ship as a whole. The levels represent the multiple layers that make up organ walls. On a ship, you have a deck crew in charge of navigation duties, sail handling, tending lines, cleaning, etc. And you also have a galley crew that are in charge of all things happening below deck. Stowing gear, stocking supplies, checking the engines, whatever happens below deck. In a similar fashion, we can think of the gastrointestinal tract's many layers. And these are different levels that house multitudes of workers performing different types of work, but they all belong to the same crew and they all keep things running smoothly, except for a few bad players, which we'll talk about later. So for the purposes of this very basic anatomy class, think of the nervous system as having two main decks. There's the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the structures that enable sensation and movement. And then the peripheral nervous system is made up of the cranial nerves, which are involved in capturing and sending information to the brain to enable you to see, smell, taste, hear, and move your facial muscles. And then there's the spinal nerves, which carry movement, signals, and sensation. The peripheral nervous system, or PNS, also includes two important networks: the somatic nervous system, which controls voluntary movements and receives sensory input from the skin and muscles, and its counterpart, the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. So again, the PNS, peripheral nervous system, has two parts. The somatic part: when you hear somatic, think immediately muscles, coordinated movement, and the autonomic nervous system, which is heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, digestion, and arousal. That's the autonomic nervous system, which are, think of actions that are not conscious or activities that are not conscious. The autonomic nervous system is divided again into two parts: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, I know that was confusing, so if you want to pause, take a pause here and take a look at the visuals that I put on the screen and let the name sink in. And while you're doing that, just imagine you are having a picnic at the beach with your BFF and you're sitting in the sand, you're relaxed, the weather is nice, you're able to, have a relaxed time and have a snack while you're listening to your friend. All of a sudden, the sky gets cloudy and you get a chilly breeze, and within minutes, it starts raining. And then the cold rain touches your warm skin, it's still warm from the sun, and you get goosebumps. And so you stand up and you start packing your stuff while you are still finishing your snack, you're still listening to your friend, you are getting ready to bolt and run to the car, and all of these things are happening at the same time. And the reason these actions can happen simultaneously, and that is possible, is because your nervous system is divided into multiple networks of neural activity. So let's move on. Now picture a third system that works in tandem and also remains kind of independent in its decision making. That's our enteric nervous system working in tandem with these other nervous systems that I just described, It is just integrated to the autonomic nervous system, but independently manages hundreds of digestion-related processes while being in constant communication with the other neural networks in the brain. But what is so special about the gut that requires all this neuron-powered activity, you might ask? So, to keep things simple, the gut is trying to do two things. One is get nutrients from food, and food is constantly passing through the GI tract, or not constantly, but after a meal it passes through the GI tract, while it's also separating waste and pushing that waste down through the colon until it reaches, the exit. So this might sound simple, but how can the gut know what to keep and what to push out? And also, how does it know if there is a pathogen or something that could cause harm that is traveling along the digested food? So these are great questions. This process requires lots of communication between these different layers and millions of specialized workers combining different molecules into new substances that can be used by your nerve cells to communicate with other nerve cells, and so on. Kind of like a relay race of sorts. The new substances I'm talking about can be neurotransmitters, hormones, neuropeptides, and cytokines. The latter help regulate inflammation and immune responses. To reach their destination, these chemical messengers can travel really fast or take a little longer to coordinate various other functions, kind of like chief officers directing traffic or coordinating with other crew members when some processes need to start and other processes need to end. Now, there is a key structure that enables really fast two-way communications between the gut and the brain, and that structure is called the vagus nerve. This is one of the most important structures of the parasympathetic nervous system because it is the one physical structure that connects it all together. The vagus nerve, also called cranial nerve X or pneumogastric nerve, is called the vagus nerve because vagus means wandering, and that is very appropriate for the vagus nerve because its path is very long and winding, and it takes frequent turns starting at the brainstem and then splitting into the anterior trunk and the posterior trunk. These trunks descend into the abdomen and branch into multiple organs. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the human body, and I could make a 1-hour video just talking about it, but what's important to know for our purposes today is that it innervates, or in other words, supplies nerves to multiple organs, such as the stomach and the small and large intestines. The vagus nerve is such an important component of the brain-gut axis, and it impacts everything from inflammation to intestinal mobility, permeability, and mood. There are some theories out there that propose the idea that neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease begin in the gut and expand to the brain via the vagus nerve. Okay, so to recap, we've talked about the nervous system and how there is a central and a peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system splits into the autonomic and somatic processes, remember somatic muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which splits further into the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. All in the name of efficiency so that we don't have to remember to breathe or tell our heart to pump blood. Then we have the second brain or enteric nervous system, which houses hundreds of millions of neurons and also billions of bacteria in the gut, constantly creating the very substances needed for those neurons to be able to communicate with each other and enable digestion and so much more. We also talked about the vagus nerve being the one major two-way highway that enables sensory data and motor data to enable many of the essential functions that sustain life. And we talked about how it splits into many smaller branches and goes into the intestinal wall. Okay, so let's talk about the intestinal wall and how it contains lots and lots of branches of nerves called ganglionated plexuses. So these plexuses are basically networks of nerve fibers. And these webs of nerves, because that's what they are, they're web-like, they are organized into submucosal and myenteric ganglia. I'm gonna pause and tell you what those things are. So the mucosa of the gut is basically the lining of the gut. And the mucosa is the layer that touches food as it is passing through the GI tract. And the myenteric ganglia, myenteric means muscle coating. And it's this coating that basically coats the length of the intestinal wall. These systems are located, or these plexuses are located between the longitudinal and circular muscles in the gut. And these muscles are there for many reasons, but one of the reasons why we have muscles there is to be able to enable something called peristalsis, which is little waves that create movement and help food pass along the GI tract, which, as you probably know, is very, very long. So that's one of the reasons we have muscles in that area. In other words, these clusters of abdominal nerve cells are really well integrated across all these different muscle layers. Some are long and some are like rings, and they are embedded. And I think I said this already, but the mucosa is the innermost layer of the small intestine and the one that is in direct contact with pre-digested food, and it plays a huge role in absorption. So that's what you should always remember when you hear the word mucosa. Think about food absorption, or nutrient absorption rather. So when the mucosa is compromised for whatever reason or thrown off balance, we feel it right away, because it can impact how we physically feel and also how we feel emotionally, and vice versa. So a strong negative reaction or event can really upset the delicate balance of our gut microbiome. So the topmost layer is called the mesentery, which is the layer of tissue that holds your guts in place. And then you have the small intestine, which is very long and it's flexible and it's tubular, and it's made up of 3 main parts. And you've probably heard of them. They're always fun to pronounce. These are the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And these tube-like organs are the middleman between the stomach and the large intestine. Each of them are in charge of receiving different nutrient types. For example, the duodenum uses bile from the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas to further digest food. And this is where most of the iron that we get from our diet gets absorbed. By the way, bile is necessary to help break down fats. That is why people who have had their gallbladder removed, they can't eat greasy foods, because they just can't digest them properly anymore. They don't have that bile getting pumped into chyme as it is entering the gut. So they have to make major diet adjustments post-surgery to be able to digest food properly. Okay, and then there's the jejunum, which is really, it's an interesting word. And always fun to pronounce. And it is also a major site for absorbing folic acid. I'll talk more about folic acid later. It's a really important nutrient. And I also found that it comes from the Latin word jejunus, which means empty, fasting, or hungry. The Greeks named it like that because this part of the small intestine was often found void of food after death. Okay. So the ileum, at last, which is the longest section and where most nutrients from food are absorbed, in particular vitamin B12, which I'll also talk more about later. This cannot happen without something called intrinsic factor, which is produced in the stomach and found in stomach acid. So, you know, people that take proton pump inhibitors regularly, like Pepto-Bismol and Tums and things like that, may have lower levels of vitamin B12 because they don't have that intrinsic acid which helps absorb vitamin B12. So when you think vitamin B12, think of brain and nerve health and energy. B12, energy. And B12 mainly comes from dairy, meat, fish, and some fortified cereals. It may also be called cobalamin in the label. Cobalamin, C-O-B-A-L-A-M-I-N. Cobalamin. Okay, so that was a lot of information. We'll let that marinate and talk about the relationship between the gut and emotions on my next video. I'll see you there.